Okay, this is going to be a really quick tutorial on how to just kind of get started in ZBrush. And so if you're working on like a model like a character head where you need multiple objects imported into your scene, be sure to watch my next video that goes over subtools. That's how you can bring in multiple objects into a scene. So for instance, if you have like a character's head, you have the character's eyes as separate OBJs, which I often recommend, then that would be a good video to look at. But this video, we're just going to focus on just the overview of the interface, how to get started and get comfortable with things. So when you open ZBrush, you'll first notice that this tab is open. It's called the Lightbox, and so you can hide it by clicking on that button. Let's see if we can get my computer to catch up. And under the Lightbox, you can keep a library, essentially, of different objects, different brushes that you've either downloaded from online or created. So you can see down here, like I have some custom brushes that I got at one point that emulate like the surface of bark for trees, all that stuff. So that's where you can kind of save assets. So let's close that down and let's just take a quick look at the interface. So we have our canvas right here, and you can kind of change the canvas size through this document panel, but we're not really going to worry about that because that's not really important for learning the core fundamentals. We have over here, we have the tool panel, so we're going to go over this a lot. So this is where you can save your ZTL files or your ZTool files. So you can load previous tools or save tools, and what a ZTool is in ZBrush is essentially it's how you save your project so that you can open a ZTL file again in ZBrush a couple of days down the road, and it'll just open up your ZBrush document just the way you remember with the all of the geometry changes, all that stuff intact. And so you're going to mainly work that way with these buttons up here under the tool menu when saving or loading previous ZBrush projects. We also have this import button that's right there. So if you export an OBJ out of a program like Maya or Blender, you can click on this import button and import your OBJ. You can also export OBJs out of ZBrush and send it back to those programs. And so this is where you're gonna manage your projects and your files. Down here, you'll also see this right here. It says Tool, and if I just click on that big button right there, you can see that we could choose to start with like a base cylinder or a cube or a sphere. And also when we import OBJs in later, they'll show up down here. And so we'll go over that in just a minute. Over here we have some buttons that we'll go over in the future that are really helpful for adding perspective. You can move your camera around here if you have trouble with shortcuts. And we'll go over this side once we get our model imported. So let's just go ahead. We could start a project by starting with a sphere, but instead I'm just going to import an OBJ. And there's kind of like a launch procedure that has to take place, so you have to remember about 3 steps in order to get started. The good news is it's the same whether I'm importing an OBJ or if I'm starting with one of these base objects down here. So I'm just going to go to import, and that usually takes a second just to open. Here we go, and I just have a base head, OBJ that I'm going to import into my scene. And so you can see the base head shows up right there under the tools. And so there's 3 steps that I need to do. So the first step is I need to click and drag onto my canvas while holding Shift. And so what Shift does is it snaps it to 45-degree angles. And so what it's going to do is it's going to make sure if I click and drag, it kind of comes at a funky angle. But if I hold Shift now, so I'm clicking and hold Shift, you can see it goes to 45 degrees. I let go, get it a little bit closer to up and down, hold Shift, and then it snaps it up and down. If I drag up or down, the object gets bigger or smaller. And so from here, I'm just going to let go. And the object should come into place. So that's step 1. And so if I don't do step 2 and 3, what's going to happen is when I draw, it's just, instead of sculpting on my head, it's just going to draw multiple heads. So that's why there's 3 steps right here. So again, step 1 is I'm just going to click and drag and hold Shift to snap that and let go. Step 2 is I need to press T or press this edit button. And then step 3, the final step, is I need to go over here under the tool menu, and I need to make this a polymesh 3D object. And so again, it's this button right here, and I'll just click that. And so now this thing should be ready to sculpt. So if I click and drag, you can see this thing's finally sculpting. But you'll notice that symmetry is not turned on. Most of the time you're going to want symmetry. And so if you want to turn symmetry on quickly, you can press X on your keyboard, and that'll enable symmetry right there. So X as in Xerox. You can also go up to Transform at the top bar and find Activate Symmetry right there. And you can see I can have it mirror across the X-axis, but I can also choose Y and Z as well. And I could even, by the way, have multiple going at the same time. So when I'm sculpting, it's sculpting in multiple places, but X is fine. Okay, and so the final step that's really important before you get started sculpting is to turn on perspective. If you don't have perspective turned on, this is kind of like the orthographic view in Maya, and your sculpt's going to come out wrong. And so a lot of people forget this, especially early on when working in the program, and you just want to be sure to click that and turn it on. You can also press P as in perspective to turn that on. And so from here, let's talk about camera navigation. So as I said before, if I hold Shift, it snaps the object to 90-degree angle, so that can be really helpful as you're working. To rotate, let's talk about how to rotate, pan, and zoom in on our sculpt. So to rotate, I just click anywhere, just a normal left click on the outside area, outside of my model. I can hold Shift to snap it back again. And, oops, I turned caps lock on. And so next, I'm on a Mac, so if I hold down Option and right click, that allows me to pan the model. So this option on a Mac, and I'm right clicking, and if you're on a PC, it'll be Alt. And I'm on a Mac, and if I want to zoom in, I hold Command, and if you're on a PC, it'll be Control, and I right click and drag left and right. And that allows me to zoom in and out. So again, I can rotate just by clicking out here. I can pan by holding Option and right clicking, and then the next button down, if I hold Command and right click, I'll zoom in and out. The last of these navigations that's really important is if you press F, that'll frame up your object. So if you ever just end up with a model over here and you're trying to get it back on the screen, just press F and it'll frame it back up again. So all those controls that I was just describing are also available down here. So I can move by just clicking where it says move, I can zoom in and out, I can rotate, and then frame. So if there's ever an instance where you just don't have access to your keyboard or something like that, you have these options. But again, that gets pretty clunky, and I think there's just a handful of shortcuts that are going to be really helpful to know in this program to make it work as smoothly as possible. You know, the goal when working with software in my mind is always to get it to as close as possible to working in real life, so you're not having to worry about finding buttons, right? Just kind of get muscle memory on the shortcuts. So those are really important shortcuts for those right there. So next, let's talk about the geometry is pretty low on this right now. And so the whole advantage of Zbrush is it's a sculpting program. And I can add millions of subdivisions on this and get really creative organic sculpts on my model. So if we scroll below and go down to geometry, I have the geometry tab open, and I can just easily just click and divide my geometry. So this is just like smoothing in Maya, except for I can add a lot more subdivisions in this program. And also it's very easy for me to move back and forth between subdivisions using the slider. So I can easily go back to the first subdivision and back up to 4. And often there's advantages to kind of keeping that active and kind of moving back and forth a little bit, especially early on in the process. So I can divide the geometry right there, and I can move back and forth. I can kind of move to the lower resolution or move to the higher resolution by doing that, but I always just use the slider instead. You can also, if you wanted to, you can delete the lower resolutions if you want to by clicking that button. So geometry is a pretty straightforward tab right there in a lot of ways. We can get more advanced with it. So let's see here. Like Dynamesh is a really cool option. This we can go over in a later tutorial that allows you to update the topology of your model. So if you're trying to kind of do some creative sculpting and kind of go off model a little bit, Dynamesh can be a really useful thing to look up in the future. So we're about ready to sculpt, and so that's going to bring us over to this section over here. And so anything that's in this section, by the way, I can just hold Spacebar and I can get it right here. And so often you'll see me hold down Spacebar, and I can change all those options that are on the left side of my interface, but I also have more controls right here as well. So just really useful, the Spacebar shortcut. And so let's kind of start down here. So we don't really, don't worry about the color. You just don't touch it when sculpting, essentially. And these three are options that we'll get into more when you get into detail sculpting. So yeah, detail sculpting, this stuff can become useful, but right now we're just worrying about the overall more basic functions. And so right here, we can change the material. And so one thing that's important to remember is these materials, this is just the way that your model previews in ZBrush. So the material you choose here has no effect on when you export the OBJ, what it's going to look like when you export it back into Blender or Maya. So this is just for preview purposes. And just while sculpting, you know, different people like their model to, you know, look different ways, right? So just keep in mind that that's, and we have a ton of options right here. You can even find custom materials online and download them and import them into your Lightbox menu up here if you want to kind of experiment with other materials. So that's that panel right there. And then up here is the brush menu. And so one thing that ZBrush has going for it is it has a lot of brushes. And remember, I can also get to that by holding Spacebar and clicking right there. And so the standard brush looks like this when you sculpt on it. It's a nice little brush. And let me just give this a little more subdivisions so we can kind of see this in full detail. When I first start sculpting on a model, my preference is I usually use the, I'll use the standard brush a little bit, and I'll use clay tubes and the move brush. Those are kind of my favorite set. And so with the standard brush, I can click and it looks like that. One really helpful shortcut is if I hold Shift, my brush automatically goes to smooth. No matter what brush I'm on, it'll go to the smooth brush. And so what the smooth brush does is it just evens things out. So I hold Shift and you can see it just kind of smooths it out right there. So Shift is always available for you right there. And so finding these other brushes, you'll notice that we have Quick Pick, which is at the top. So your recent brushes will show up at the top, so that'll be useful. Another useful thing is these are in alphabetical order. And so let's say I want to find my clay tubes brush. I can press C, and that narrows it down to the brushes that start with C. And then since I like clay tubes, I can press T now. So if I press CT, I can quickly get to my clay tubes brush. And one reason I like the clay tubes brush is you can just kind of build up your brush really, your materials really quickly using this brush. So I can click on that, and let me just add a little more subdivisions right there. And one thing to remember, so kind of moving back to the holding Spacebar, is we have the brush size right here, so I can change the brush size. The focal shift is that ring that's on the inside, and so that's basically the fall off of the brush. So think of focal shift as the fall off. And then Z intensity is just the intensity of the brush. And so when I'm sculpting with the clay tubes brush, I like to kind of keep the intensity nice and low and just kind of build things up more gradually right here. And one thing that you'll also note is if I hold down Option while I'm using the brush, it's going to cut into the model. And so this kind of goes back to why I like the clay tubes brush, is you can kind of build up mass on your model. So I can build onto my model, or I can hold Option or Alt on a PC, and I can subtract into my model and cut into it using that. And it kind of just, I don't know, it kind of works the way that I'm used to seeing with clay, right? And so that Option button, a really important shortcut right there. You can also, under Spacebar, we can go to Z sub right here. So if you can't remember the Option button to subtract, you can just click on that button right there. And so early sculpting, I usually use the standard brush, the clay tubes brush, and then probably most important of these brushes is the move brush. So I'm just going to hold Spacebar and go right there, or I can just go up here, and I can click. And so the move brush, I'll press M, and then you can see that narrows my brushes down to the brushes that start with M, and then V. So MV quickly brings me to the move brush. You'll also notice if I go back up to my brush menu, these brushes that I've been using will show up in the top. And so if I click and hold that down, the move brush, I like to use like a large draw size for it, and you can, really change the overall shape of your model, right? So it can be drastic stuff like that, or if I want to just kind of change proportions and, so like this jawline looks a little bit strange, right? So if I want to kind of make adjustments to my jawline, I can use the move brush to kind of make bigger, broader changes to my model and get that working nicely. And keep in mind that you can hold shift to smooth things out. When I hold shift, you see my brush goes to blue and it shows smooth up there. The lower the subdivision is, the more smooth we'll do. So you can see I'm at a pretty high subdivision level right now, and so if I hold shift, well, now it's going. But it's, remember you have the intensity of the brush when you're holding shift, and we have the size. But you can also, if it's not doing much for you, when you hold shift, you can also move it to a lower subdivision level, and it'll kind of do a little bit more damage when you're on the lower subdivision level a lot of the time. But yeah, just keep in mind that if you hold spacebar and shift, you get the intensity of the smooth brush. And so that's essentially all you really need to know in order to get, really started with the program. And when you're done, when you're ready to kind of import this model back into Maya, and let's say you want to use the quad draw tool to retopologize it or something like that, you just go to export, and you'll export it as an OBJ, or you can save up here, save as, and save it as a ZTL. And if you want to be able to open it again in Zbrush and have your subdivision levels and some of this information, like what material you're using, come back and be as you left it. So if you want to go back and work on it in Zbrush, you save up here. If you want to export it back to Maya or Blender, you export right there. And remember, when you export it, it's going to export at whatever subdivision level you're currently on. And so it's subdivision level 5. If I bring this back into Maya, it's going to come in at that subdivision level, okay? And so, just be smart about what subdivision level you bring this back into Maya as.